I read 14 books this month. Let's talk about them. Hello everyone and welcome back to today's video. I am Liz and today we are going to be talking about the 14 books that I read in the month of January. First off, I just want to start by saying I did not expect to read this much this month. I felt like right as soon as January hit and like this whole new year started, I was so motivated to read. Like I was at a pace where every 2 days I was finishing a book and I kept that pace until like the very end of the month. To me, that is just wild and just insane that I was able to read that much in that amount of time. I don't know if it's because when I set my reading goal for the year, if that was just motivating me to get like a lot of my reading done early. Maybe it's the fact that I'm on a book buying ban and I'm not allowed to buy books. I just have to focus on the books that I have. I honestly don't know. I don't know if it's the fact that I'm trying to shrink my physical TBR or what, but I'm just so excited to talk about these books. I have so many 5 stars that I read this month and I cannot wait to add them to my favorites pile. And I just loved this month. There were a few letdowns, I will say that, but most of the books that I read, I really thoroughly enjoyed. Let's talk about them. Starting the year off with a bang, I started Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. Really loved this book. I gave it a 5 stars. This was just such a wholesome and sweet romance. I miss that because I feel like in a lot of fantasy worlds, none of the romances are necessarily wholesome or sweet. Yes, they were rivals in this book, so it's kind of like the enemies to lovers trope, but not really. Like just the way that their 2 characters developed in this story and just the lengths that they would go to for each other. It was just such a sweet story that it really just truly grabbed my heart and I ripped it out of my chest. I loved the 2 main characters in this book. I feel like they both had so much depth and I loved that you got both point of views so that way you could really see what the other person was thinking the whole time. Also, absolutely loved the typewriters. The whole like concept of having magical typewriters was amazing. I have always wanted to get like an old vintage typewriter to like throw on my bookshelf. So reading about typewriters has just made me want one even more, even though obviously I have no space for a typewriter, but I absolutely adored it in this book. I also really loved the world and the setting. It felt like it was set back in time. I felt like the author's writing style was just very descriptive and detailed and beautiful in a way where I really felt fully immersed in this story. To me, really made this story come to life and really made me give it a 5 stars. Next up, we have Ruths Vow. So of course, this book came out right after Christmas. I knew that I was waiting to read Divine Rivals so I could read its second, the duology, immediately afterwards. This one I also gave a 5 stars because it just felt like the story wrapped up so beautifully. The way the first book ended off, this just like picked up where it left off and it really grabbed me and I was so just anxious to know what would happen with our 2 main characters and wondering how they were going to come back together and just like how this whole thing could just wrap up and conclude. I felt like also the timing in this book was very good. I felt like the big things that were happening, the bigger events, it felt like it was spaced out very well and I never felt like there was a lull maybe at the very beginning, but that was just getting back into the story. But the rest of it just like flew by for me. I was able to really connect to the characters in this book and I really could feel the love that they had for each other. And it also felt like a lot was accomplished in this story. There's some fantasy worlds or just books in general that it feels like not a whole lot happens. It's just it's more dialogue based, but I felt like this one had a lot of action and a lot of things happening in the story. Next up, we have A Dawn of Onyx by Kate Golden. This one I also gave a 5 stars. I started the year off with 3 5 stars. That's insane. But this book was so good. It was a fantasy world where our main character, she is this healer. She has these healing abilities that have not been seen. And so she ends up taking her brother's place in this rival kingdom to become the rival king's healer in order to save her brother and her family. I felt like right off the bat, this book, it was just very fast paced. It is a shorter fantasy book, which I feel like that really helped with the story. I think that if it was longer, I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much as I did. It very much just got to the point. I also loved the chemistry between the 2 main characters and their banter. Very much reminded me of the couples in Powerless and Fourth Wing. Just the way that they talk to each other. It was just so funny and I found myself laughing and just smiling constantly when I was reading their conversations. Also, if you've ever read the Lachlan Feud series, which is 4 books, this very much reminded me of that series. I don't know what exactly about that series it reminded me of, but it just kind of had that same overall vibe that I got of that series and I really enjoyed that. And you know, it also had all of the tropes that I absolutely love in all of my fantasy books. So a morally gray main male character, you have the one bed trope, you have the who did this to you, like just everything about it was just awesome. Next up, we have The Night Circus by by Erin Morgenstern. This one I gave a 3 stars. Now I was really anticipating this book at the start of this year. I really wanted to read this in the winter time. I had bought it last summer thinking about reading it, and I've always wanted to read it. And I'm really glad I did. I know 3 stars doesn't sound crazy or great compared to the 3 5-star reads that I just mentioned, but I felt like this book was very good. It was very detail based, very magical and lyrical, the writing. And I do feel like I could picture everything that was happening. I don't know how else to describe it. If I had one word to describe this book, it would just be magical, because the entire thing was based off of magic or just your perception of things. It was written in the 3rd person omniscient point of view, so that was a little hard to get used to. I felt like I didn't connect to the characters as much as I wanted to because of the way it was written. Not that that's a bad thing, because you do bounce around from many different characters within the story. Also, it bounces between different timelines, so you really have to pay attention to the beginning of each chapter, what character you're learning about and what's the time frame, because that you have to kind of get used to as well. But I do feel like it all tied together and it made sense the way it was written. It was just a little harder and a little bit more confusing than I thought it was going to be. Also, it was definitely a slower paced book and had a very slow burn romance. So if you're interested in this book because of the romance, I highly recommend you think differently, because I don't think the romance was like the main focal point. I feel like it was more the magic and the circus that was the main focal point, and the romance was just kind of a side plot. But I did enjoy it. 3 stars. I would recommend this to anybody who's really into magical realism and that type of writing. Next up, we have Secrets of Aoria by Christina Macari. I gave this one a 2 stars. Yeah, after I read those 3 5-star reads, and then I went into Night Circus and only gave it 3, and then I went into this book and gave it 2, I was afraid I was gonna go into a reading slump. I'm not gonna lie. This book just wasn't for me. I think their writing style, it was very confusing. It felt like it kind of bounced around a lot, and I don't really know what it was specifically about it, but it just wasn't for me. I felt like I didn't really connect to the characters. Also, it definitely felt like it was like present time, but then all of a sudden you have this whole nother dimension of what you would expect a fantasy world to be. And I think those two kind of things thrown together, it just didn't really make sense or didn't really vibe well in my head. I didn't understand it. And I found myself skimming through a lot of it just because I wasn't interested. I was ready for this book to be over with, which is very sad to say because I was excited about this one. Just felt like it was very all over the place for me, and that's what made me not connect to it and not really enjoy it. Our main character, she has these magical abilities that are unlocked, and she ends up going to this world, like going to stay with her mom's friend or something, and he's taking her to this secret magical world or society, this school where she's learning about her powers. And I don't know, it was just a lot wrapped into one book. And there's also like secrets you're uncovering about her grandma and back when she went to school here. I don't know, it had a really interesting concept behind it, or a very interesting story idea, I will say, but it just kind of fell flat for me. Next, we have The Sevene Slip by Ashley Poston. This, obviously, you can tell from how big my smile is. This was a 5-star read for me. I don't know if I have ever connected to a story the way I connected to this story. I felt like the main character and I were very similar in the way that we handle things, and also in just like where she was in her career path, where you feel like you're trying to go, you're trying to be successful, but also you're finding out that that's not what makes you happy anymore. And I just felt like I connected to this on a very deep level with not only the romance, the romance was amazing, but also just I felt like the just character development and the things that she was going through in her life. Honestly, this book made me cry a couple of times because it was just making me reflect on my own life and the things that make me happy. And I feel like you just learned so much about the characters. They learned so much about themselves, and through the help of each other, I feel like they both were just able to reach like their true potential. And I loved seeing that in a story. And in case you didn't know what it's about this girl who goes to stay in her aunt's apartment. If it turns out her aunt's apartment is magical, sometimes when she steps into the apartment, it is 7 years in the past, and 7 years in the past, there's a guy who is living in this apartment for the summer. So that's how they strike up this romance. Yes, this guy is walking around in her day-to-day life somewhere out there in the world, but you're getting to see her meet him 7 years in the past. And it was just very interesting. I thought that was such a cool concept about a magical apartment. Next up, we have The Curse of Saints by Kate Dramis or Dramis. I don't know how you say her name. 5 stars. 5 freaking stars. The reason why I gave this 5 stars is it reminded me of Throne of Glass, and if you don't know, that is my all-time favorite book series in the world. That's what made me fall in love with reading. I first started Throne of Glass when it first came out, the very first book, and I was that person who waited every single year for the next book to come out. And I would reread the book before the next book came out, and then I would reread the first book and second book, and when the third book came out, like, I was a diehard fan. I still am a diehard fan. This book gave me serious Throne of Glass vibes with just the way the main character was so strong, like our main character in Throne of Glass. I felt like she just was so powerful, and I love seeing that in my main characters. It had a slow burn romance, but I felt like it was done in such a good way. You do get both point of views and a third point of view as well, which I enjoyed seeing. I felt like it was kind of necessary to the story. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had the insight I had going through the different things that were happening. But we're in this story, our main character, she is a spy master for her kingdom. She's also the queen's third in command, and the whole enemies to lovers in this book is it's between her and the queen's second in command, and they both are kind of thrust together to actually figure out some things because she has a hidden power that gets unlocked, and it's just, it felt like such a cool world. I felt like the magic system was so complex and different than what I'm used to in a fantasy world, and I was just so intrigued. There is, at the beginning of the book, you can see that they have all of the different types of magic. They have it listed so you can kind of keep track, because there is a lot of different like fantasy words that are hard to understand or remember. So I did refer back to that page a lot while I was reading, but I didn't feel like that impacted how the reading experience was. I felt like it just made it more deeper for me, and it was very fast-paced. The action throughout this whole story I felt like was very fast-paced. Chapters were very short and quick, and I cannot wait for the second one. Next up, we have Better Than Fiction by Alexa Martin. This one I gave a solid 3 stars. Now, to me, the reason why I gave it 3 stars is it just felt like a very mid romance for me. After reading the Sevene Slip, I don't know. I don't know if that's gonna be like my new measure for romance books. Like, if you don't top the Sevene Slip, then you are never gonna be a 5 star. And I don't know. I felt kind of bad when I was reading this one because I felt like I was judging it and comparing it to the Sevene Slip, which definitely can impact a rating for a book for me. It was a very cute romance though between a bookshop owner who takes over her grandma's bookshop when she passes away and a romance author. So I felt like that was a very quirky and kind of fun romance or twist on a romance. I also really loved reading about the bookstore and kind of seeing the ins and outs of how it is to run a bookstore. I personally, my dream in life is to own a bookshop and have it be like my family business. I would absolutely love that, and also for there to be a coffee shop attached to it. So that is my dream, and I felt like my dream was coming true while reading this book. So that is why I gave it a 3 stars, because of the bookstore. I do feel like though the romance was a little too fast for my liking. I felt like it was almost more insta-lovey than I necessarily wanted, and I also really wanted to see more of the main character and her sister's relationship because they're half siblings, and I felt like there was a lot to unpack there because it was their first time really bonding as sisters, but it just felt like they didn't have that many scenes together, and then by the end all of a sudden they're like besties, so we didn't get to see the full depth of their relationship. So I do wish I got to see more of that. Next up, we have The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. This one I gave a 3.75 stars. Now, I was really excited to read this book, and I'm really glad I did. I would recommend this to anyone who is interested in a murder mystery type book. It was very much Groundhog Day meets Clue, so if you're interested in those kind of themes in a book, that's what this was. It was very complex, very unique. I felt like the ending was so satisfying for me, and I also felt like it was so cool getting to see our main character jump from host to host. So in this world, our main character wakes up with no recollection of who he is or where he is, and all of a sudden he has to figure out a murder. And he also learns along the way that he has to figure out who the murderer is in order to break out of this Groundhog Day that he's kind of stuck in. And each of the 7 or 8 days that he is in this, he jumps from different hosts. And I really liked that about the story. I really liked getting to see the different hosts and how each character was a little different. It didn't feel like it was just cut and paste to the same character, just in a different body. I felt like his hosts also contributed to his personality within the story. And I thought that was really interesting and cool to see. I will say it is a very confusing and detailed book. So if you are not paying attention, if you want light reading, do not read this book. But if you are interested in a complex and very intriguing and just mind-bending story, this is for you. Next up, we have The Housemaid Secret by Frida McFadden. I read The Housemaid back in the fall and I gave it a 5 stars. It's one of my favorite thriller books. And also she is a new author for me. I absolutely love her writing now and I'm really looking forward to reading more of her books this year. This is the second book. It kind of picks up a little after the first book and I really enjoyed it. I gave this one a 4.5 stars. So not a perfect 5, but still very high. I really enjoyed getting to re-see some of the same characters from the first book and kind of seeing where they are now in life, because the way the first book ended, it leaves you with a lot of questions on what are they gonna do. And I really liked getting to see that in here. It felt like it wrapped up very seamlessly. It also had a really cool twist at the end, as Frida McFadden's writing always does. I thought it was very good, very fast paced, very fun. The story was very unique and interesting. It wasn't as good as the first one, I think, for me, just because the twist wasn't as like shocking to me. I feel like the first one, I was binging it and it was like immediate. As soon as I read the plot twist, I was just like, but in this one, yes, it had a plot twist, but it wasn't as shocking to me as the first one. So that's why it's not a perfect 5. Still really enjoyed it. Definitely will continue reading her books this year. Next up, we have Fall of Ruin and Wrath by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This one I gave a 4 stars. I did really enjoy the magic and the world that you were in for this one. The romance was very funny. However, the reason why I gave it a 4 stars and not higher is because it felt like the banter, it was so funny at first. And I think if you've read From Blood and Ash, you probably understand what I'm saying. But it felt like the banter was very repetitive, like a lot of the same kind of jokes or just the way that they were talking. It's just very repetitive. It started to get a little annoying towards the end, but I did enjoy it. It did make me laugh a few times and I was very intrigued. It felt like it sucked me in from the very beginning. I was totally involved with the story from the get-go. I do wish that the romance though was not focused so hard around all of the physical and like lust. I felt like that's what it mainly surrounded. And I just wish that it was more on like a deeper level. I feel like with Divine Rivals, I had that deeper level and that was great. I adored that in that book, but this one was more just physical and lust. I will say not a lot happens in this book. I don't feel like the story got very far in this book. However, I do think with the way it ended, the ending was very fast paced. I felt like a lot happened at the end. And I do think that it'll eventually in the second book will answer a lot of my questions I had. I'm hoping the second book will have a lot more in it, like with all the repetitive conversations, maybe some more things could have happened in the plot. Still really enjoyed it. The ending left off a little weird for my liking, but in a way where I still want to read the second book and am very excited to do so. Next up, we have The Whispering Dark by Kelly Andrew. This book I gave a 3 stars. Now, still a solid rating. I will say this book was very eerie and had very spooky vibes. I was not gonna lie, a little creeped out when I was reading this book. I kind of wish I read this like October during like the spookier season. However, it was on my fall TBR and I saw it on my TBR cart and I just thought, you know what, why not? I've been cruising through my winter TBR and I kind of wanted to revisit this one and I'm glad I did. I was very intrigued with the story, with the whole concept of being able to jump between realities or between worlds. I thought that was very cool and getting to see and the description of how that happens. I thought that was very interesting. However, I will say I didn't understand a lot of what was going on during this book. It was very confusing at times. Felt like there were a lot of questions throughout the entire story and I don't feel like all of them were answered by the end. That's kind of why I gave it a 3 stars. The world itself, it did pull me in and like I said, it creeped me out, which is exactly, I'm sure, what the author was trying to do. So if you're able to pull out those emotions in me, great, you're doing your job. I just wish that it was a little bit more clear towards the end of what was happening because it just, I don't know, it felt like there was this huge scene going on and I was just like, what? I had to go back and reread it a few times just to kind of understand it. And even then I still had questions. So that's why I think this is just the 3 stars for me. I still would recommend it to people, especially in the fall time. Next up, we have Pathu Mary. Next up, we have Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry. This is his memoir. I was so excited to read this book. One of my reading goals for this year is to read at least 5 memoirs by the end of the year, and this is my first one to read this year. I really enjoyed it. I actually ended up listening to this as an audiobook because Matthew Perry actually narrates it, and I really wanted to hear his voice, especially if you've ever seen Friends and you know Chandler's sense of humor. I really wanted to hear that and see that in his book, and I feel like he definitely delivered. The whole book, it felt like it was his dry, kind of dark sense of humor. Felt like I was watching a Friends episode where it was all about Chandler. So I really liked that, really enjoyed it. I feel like Matthew Perry as a person is very close to his character Chandler Bing in Friends, and I really liked getting to see some of the inner workings of Friends, how Friends came to be, how the actors were chosen, how they all bonded as a friend group but also as like a chosen family. And I also feel like he opened my eyes to a lot about drug addiction and also a lot about alcoholism. So that was really interesting to read about in a more Hollywood world, just similar to Jeanette McCurdy's, where I feel like my eyes were just opened to what it's like to be an actor or a star, someone who's famous. Very deep story. No rating for this one because it's a memoir. Really liked it though. And last but not least, we have The Stars Are Dying by Chloe Peñaranda. I ended up giving this one a 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed this fantasy world. I felt like the story, there were no lulls. Like it felt like it was very fast paced. A lot was accomplished in this book. Like from the first page, it felt like you were just on a ride and you're just holding on, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. I didn't give it a full 5 stars though, just because it felt like there were some parts, especially towards the end, that just like with the way things ended off, I didn't love the ending. The main character at some points, she was like so strong. Like she felt like she was a boss, but then, and like she can throw daggers with accuracy. She has great aim with a bow and arrow. And then all of a sudden there's these scenes where she just gets overpowered and it felt like she was so weak. So I was just confused. However, I still really enjoyed it. 4.5, like I said. I really enjoyed the two main characters' relationship and how it progressed throughout the whole story. It felt like an actual relationship was built. It wasn't just all of a sudden thrown on you. Like it actually felt like they built something. And I'm very excited for the second book. I looked it up and it's not coming out anytime soon, but I cannot wait for that book to come out because I have lots of questions from how this book ended. You guessed it. Here's all the books. And that is it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed. These are all of the books that I read in January, and I am so happy with how this month turned out. So many 5-star reads and so many just high ratings on these books. I feel like I discovered some new authors, and I'm really excited for the rest of this year to continue reading these authors. Hopefully it gave you some ideas for some books that you could possibly read. Hopefully these reviews helped. I'm trying not to go into so much detail about what each book is about because I feel like I keep repeating myself, and I'd rather just talk about the types of books and just kind of give a very brief review on what each of them entails. But I also want to make sure that I'm explaining why I'm rating each book the way I rate them. But once again, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in my next video. Happy reading. Bye.